Hello everyone! So in this step-by-step tutorial, I'll be showing you how to make this double loop cowl. This is a great project for knitters of any skill level from beginner to advanced, and all you need to know already to follow along this tutorial is how to knit and purl, and then I'll show you the rest. As always, a PDF of the pattern is linked in the description box below, so if you want to follow along with the written version, you have that available. And if you have any questions along the way, feel free to leave them in the comments. To knit this cowl, you're going to need three things. First is the yarn, then we're going to need one stitch marker, and then finally the knitting needles. So starting with the yarn I'll be using in this tutorial is knitted Wit Cotton Candy, and this is a super bulky yarn. This yarn I purchased at my local yarn shop, so I'll be sure to link this one down below, as well as some comparable yarns. So this yarn, on the skein, I get 250 grams or 140 yards. And it's also, you'll see here, it's a size 6. So at your local craft store, if you're going to Joann's or Michael's to buy your yarn, you're going to want to look for a 6 on the label, and it'll say super bulky. And you'll note that most of those at Joann's or Michael's or AC Moore, whatever craft store you shop at, they'll typically have somewhere between, I'd say about 65 to 80 yards per ball of yarn. So you're going to want to pick up 2 of those to knit this cowl. Next, you're going to need one stitch marker, and I didn't have any stitch markers that were large enough to fit on the needles that I'm using for this project. So what I did is I just tied some extra yarn I had in a knot and left the loop. So this I'll be using as my stitch marker. And then finally, there's the knitting needles. So the knitting needles I'm using here are Leaky interchangeables on a 24-inch cord. And I'm using a US 15. The first step that I'm going to do is I'm just going to wind up this yarn, and then I'll be back to show you how to cast on. The first step will be to cast on. So we're going to want to cast on a total of 128 stitches. The cast on method I'm going to use requires us to first make a slip knot. So here I have the start of my yarn, and I'm just going to lay it over my hand. So I have the start coming out the front and the working yarn attached to the ball in the back. Then I'm just going to wrap it around my index finger twice. And to create my slip knot, I'm going to take the second loop, bring it over the first, then take the second loop, bring it over the first again, and then pull out that second loop. So that creates a slip knot. Now I can take my slip knot and slide it onto my needle. And then you can pull one of the strings to tighten up your slip knot. So you'll want to pull the one that has the tail. This slip knot that we've just put on our needle counts as our first stitch. So now we need to cast on the next 127 stitches. And to do this, I'm first going to put my hand behind my yarn. And this is the yarn that's attached to my ball of yarn. And I'm just going to wrap the yarn, grab it with my 3 fingers, then bring my finger in front of the yarn, and then just take that stitch right onto the needle. So if I do it again, I have my hand behind my yarn, grab it with my 3 fingers, bring my index finger out in front of the yarn, and all the way back around. So I've just wrapped it around my finger one time, and then I just take my needle and slide it directly on. So now I have 3 stitches. Now I'm just going to leave my hand with the yarn wrapped, or the yarn held like that, and I can keep on slipping stitches onto my needle. And you want to make sure to not pull these too tight, so you want to still be able to move them on your needle, but you also don't want them so loose that you end up with large gaps in between them. So now I'm going to continue doing that until I have 128 stitches on my needle. Now I finished casting on all of my 128 stitches. So this is where my yarn attaches to my ball of yarn. And then this end has my tail. So the next thing I'm going to want to do before I join it in the round is I'm going to want to make sure there aren't any twists going around my circle. So the way I'm going to lay my yarn down, or my work down, is I'm going to have the whole edge or where all those twists are, be on the outside of the needle when I set it down. So you'll want to rearrange everything on your needle a little bit and just make sure that all the way around it isn't twisting. When you were counting, if you had extra twists, that would have added an extra stitch to your count. So you want to make sure to recount after you twist everything, or untwist everything, so that it's all laying flat. Okay, so mine is now all laying flat, and just an example of what it would look like if it were twisted. So if it were twisted, you would see something like this. So let me choose a lighter spot on the yarn so it's a little easier to see. Here we go, get it to focus. So if this were twisted, you would have had the edge be on this side, and then all of a sudden it would have switched over to the other side. So you'd have ended up with this weird twist across the needle right here. So you just want to untwist that to get rid of that extra twist in the center. So now that it's all laid flat, we're going to want to join in the round. So how you want to pick up your work when you join in the round is you're going to want to have in your right hand, you want to have the yarn that's attached to your ball of yarn. And then in your left hand, you want to have the start of your work with the tail on it. So this way we can start knitting from the work in our right hand. And in this step, we're also going to need our stitch marker. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to place the stitch marker on my right needle. So this is going to tell me every time I get to the beginning of the round. And now for this stitch pattern on the first round, we're going to knit 2. And then we're going to purl 2. And that 4-stitch repeat of knit 2, purl 2, we're going to continue all the way across the round. So the 128 stitches that we cast on is divisible by 4. So if we counted correctly and we have the right number of stitches on our needle, we should finish the round. So right before we get back to the stitch marker, we should have a purl 2. So now I'm going to continue doing knit 2, purl 2 until I reach my stitch marker again. I just finished that first round. So the last 2 stitches that I've worked on my right needle are 2 purls. Now I'm back at the stitch marker, so I'm going to slip the stitch marker to my right needle, and then I'm going to begin working that same pattern again. So I'm just going to do another knit 2, and then I'm going to do a purl 2. And I'm going to continue this knit 2, purl 2 for this entire round. I've just finished the second round. So I just finished with 2 purl stitches. And now I'm going to slip my stitch marker to the right needle, and I'm going to begin working the 3rd row of the repeat. So in this row, we're going to do the exact opposite. So we're going to do purl 2, then we're going to do knit 2. So you're going to want to purl on top of any stitches that you had as knit stitches, and then you're going to want to knit on top of any stitches that you previously had as purl stitches. So again, our repeat here will be purl 2, bring the yarn to the back, then knit 2. And we're going to repeat those 4 stitches all the way across the round. I've now finished the 3rd round. So again, I'm going to slip my stitch marker, and now I'm going to repeat that last round one more time for my 4th round. So again, it was purl 2, then knit 2. And I'm going to repeat those 4 stitches all the way across the round. Purl 2, then knit 2. I've now finished the 4th round, and that makes up all of the rounds in our repeat. So again, going through each of those, it was first we knit 2, then purl 2. Then the second round, again, we knit 2, then purl 2. Then the 3rd and 4th rounds, we switched it, so we did purl 2, then knit 2. And now you're going to want to continue repeating those 4 rounds over and over again. And you're going to want to do this until you have enough yarn left over to cast off. Figuring out how much yarn you need to cast off can be a little bit tricky, so I would recommend you leave yourself somewhere around, let's say about 10 yards to cast off. So that'll make sure we have plenty left to cast off. And you can stop at any round once you reach that 10 yards left in your yarn. I've now reached the beginning of the round once again, so here's my beginning of the round marker, and I have about 8 to 10 yards left. So at this point, I'm going to begin casting off. Now, if you wanted to make yours any wider, this would be the point where you do that. So you could just join another ball of yarn and continue knitting until whatever width you'd want to have your cowl. But for me, this is a good width, so I'm going to stick with this. And the way I'm going to cast off is we don't need this stitch marker anymore, so I'm going to take that off. And I'm going to knit the first stitch, then knit the second stitch, then slip the first stitch I knitted over the second stitch and off my needle. Now I'm going to knit one more stitch, then take the previous stitch before that one, slide it over and off the needle. So you're going to want to continue doing this knit, then slide the previous one over and off the needle, all the way around the scarf. And it doesn't matter what round you stop knitting on. So my previous round down here would have been, it looks like I would have just been about to knit around 3, so I just finished round 2. You can finish knitting on any round you'd like, because the cast off will always be the same. So we're just going to knit, then slide the previous stitch over and off the needle. And so you can see it, the cast off edge starting to form. So it makes a really, really clean, pretty cast off edge. You also want to make sure to not pull them too tight, so you still get a little bit of stretch in that cast off edge. Once you have one more stitch on your left needle, you're just going to knit that stitch again, pass the first stitch over. And now what I do is I just pull the needle out and then make that loop a little bit larger. Then I just take my leftover yarn and I thread it through the loop. And here I just tie a little knot to secure. The final step will be to weave in my ends. So for this, I'm just going to use a large tapestry needle, and I'm going to thread, this is my cast on edge, so I'll do that one first. Just going to thread that through the tapestry needle. And then there's a variety of different ways you can weave in your ends. Everyone kind of finds their own preferred method. But what I try and do is I try and find one stitch and then follow that piece of yarn through the fabric. So let's say I'm choosing this piece of yarn right here. So this one now goes underneath again. Then it comes out. And I just follow that one strand for a couple of inches. Then once I brought it a couple inches over to the right, I'm going to reverse it and weave it in a couple inches to the left. Now I'll just stretch it out a little bit to make sure it can move around a little bit, and then I'll just cut that end. So now it's fairly hidden as to where that end was. And this scarf is, the scarf or cowl is completely reversible, so you can cut the ends on whichever end you prefer. Now for the cast off edge, you'll see that you end up with this little bump. So this was the direction I cast off in. I started over here and I went all the way around until I got back over here. And so what I do to prevent this little bump from staying there is first I weave that end through my tapestry needle. It's a little more difficult with the bulky yarn. And then I'm just gonna weave this in, starting the next area right next to where that little bump is. So when I pulled that down, it just closed up that little gap that was previously right here. So previously it looked like a big step. So when I weave it in this direction, I can get rid of that. I hope everyone enjoyed this tutorial. Again, the PDF version of this pattern is linked down below in the description box. Just click that little down arrow and it'll send you to a link to a Google PDF. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Bye.